I think you always get fantastic inroads and conversations started to then actually move debates forward and move onwards. And then you have to show grit, when it hurts and when you don't want to do this anymore, and when you feel like you've hit a wall 4 times already and it has been the same wall. Trust me, you can break through it. It's just that it sometimes takes a pretty hard head to do it. But I think that's where women have a particularly good tendency to break through barriers when they seem unsurmountable.
Hello and welcome to the Anahita Speaker Series presented by Carnegie India. Through the series, we celebrate stories of empowerment, challenges, and success from women in different fields across the globe. Stories we hope inspire young professionals. I'm Serene Joshua, Young Ambassador at Carnegie India. Today, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Janka Oertel, who is the current director of the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Janka previously worked as a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the US Berlin office. Prior to joining the GMF, she served as a program director at Kerber Foundation's Berlin office. She was also a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and worked at UN headquarters, New York, as a Carlos Schmidt Fellow. She has published widely on topics related to EU-China relations, US-China relations, security in the Asia-Pacific region, Chinese foreign policy, 5G and emerging technologies, as well as climate cooperation. Dr. Janka, thank you so much for being with us once again. If I may, I'd love to begin by asking you a few questions.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think to start off, I'd love to ask you about your journey so far. You've had an impressive career across multiple institutions and organizations. Looking back, which moments or turning points do you feel were most pivotal in shaping the path that brought you to where you are today?
So when you were going through my CV like that, the first thing I was thinking is like, man, I sound very old now because it's been a long journey to where I am right now. But I would say there are 2-3 like really important key moments. I think you listed the Carlo Schmidt Fellowship there. It's an internship program that was founded about 25 years ago. The German government said, we don't have enough people in international organizations or with an international outlook. Actually, it's very comfortable to be a German civil servant, and therefore the interest in being a civil servant internationally wasn't so high, and that's why they founded this program. And it was to incentivize sort of young people going out and working in international institutions. And I applied, not thinking that I would have a standing chance, coming from a pretty sort of standard university in Germany. I had no Harvard, no Stanford, no Yale, no anything on my resume. And I was super young. I was 21 at the time. And by good luck and good chance and a good interview, I got the opportunity, and that changed the path of my career a lot, not only because I was able to work in a very international environment, but also because I met a lot of people who had a very, very broad horizon, had very different backgrounds from mine, were very academic-y as well, but had this mix of being interested in policy and academics, and were highly political. And so for me, that moment, being able to do that, literally opened doors that otherwise would have remained closed. And I think the other sort of second big step was after finishing a PhD and sort of thinking about what to do next, that I had the opportunity of landing a job immediately after the PhD that was then in a private philanthropy in a private German foundation, but one that was working in behind the scenes dialogues between political leaders. It was working with difficult partners. It was working with China, Iran, Russia. It was a very broad portfolio, but it gave me the opportunity after a sort of a longer period of academic work of being in the room when important people were speaking and being in the room in a slightly invisible way, being the mouse in the corner, being sort of the fly on the wall. And I learned so much in those first few years, not only about sort of managing and directing and about budgeting and all of those things that are important, but actually just learning from how people with power interact. And that set me off, I think, for the rest of my career quite nicely.
Thank you so much. That sounds really interesting, and you have had a really long journey and really interesting one. I think if I could ask another question, you began your career in academia, where you built deep expertise on China, and now you work much closer to real world policy and public debates. What made you want to make that shift?
So I'm not going to say it was boring German universities that kind of dragged me out of that field, because that's not actually true. And I've always kept sort of half a foot into the academic doors. I'm currently working on a project with Oxford University where I actually enjoy that a lot. The language is different that you use. The way you are allowed to think, though, is also different in the academic field. You have a little bit more time. You have a little bit more space in terms of just pages that you're allowed to write. It doesn't have to be the 800 words short, snappy op-ed with 3 arguments, but you can actually develop a thought. So I actually still enjoy the academic-y world as well. But I realized when I did my PhD at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which is sort of the German government think tank, just being close to politics and understanding power meant that you just had to be closer to this to provide good advice. So if you wanted to be able to be relevant for real life politics, you couldn't just sit at a university. And so I think that was sort of what slowly made me move into that direction, sort of better understanding power, better understanding dynamics, and better understanding how people with political power, how they operate, and how you can then insert advice and how you then can insert ideas.
Thank you. I think moving from sort of your career to your research itself, when you first started out, much of international relations research was centered on alliances and traditional power dynamics. I think today the field looks very different, with themes like technology and supply chains and resilience that are shaping these policy conversations. How has your approach to research evolved with these shifts?
Yeah, I think this is a particularly interesting question for me, because when I started out my work and worked on my PhD, it was about China's role in the United Nations. And actually, this whole book that I wrote was still oozing this idea of what amazing world could emerge if a developing country of the size of China decides to really take sort of the United Nations at the heart of its foreign policy approach, supports the organization, supports its peace and development efforts, and actually builds a form of global governance with the existing global powers that then serves to build a better and just world. And honestly, in the late 2000s, that spirit was just there, right? It was a moment of opportunity in which China was ramping up its peacekeeping initiatives. It was ramping up in the development space. It became this idea of, wow, there's an alternative model out there that doesn't have to be antagonistic, but actually can augment and enhance efforts that are underway. And boy, was I wrong. It's also something that you have to realize sometimes, that these very positive ideas that I had about the future role China could play in these institutions has just not materialized. And with the emergence of Xi Jinping, has taken a different role and has taken a different route. And I think for me, that was a development that was quite striking and turned me from what David Rennie from The Economist once called, it's not the hawks, it's the disappointed dove. I think that's what I am. And in a way, the 5G saga was what flipped everything around in 2018, 2019, when for the first time, China experts were called by journalists and were asked whether it is safe or not to install Chinese vendor technology into telecommunications networks. And honestly, when the first time the question was asked, it was like, what is a radio access network? What does this mean at all? Because I'm a China watcher. I know foreign policy. I do not understand what you're talking about. Yeah. But interestingly, the technology people had the same questions asked and were asked whether, what does China mean in this? And they had no idea. And so we stuck our heads together and we're actually working very closely with each other and trying to understand for the China experts, what the technology means, for the technology experts, how China operates and how the communist leadership operates under the current circumstances, and thereby building knowledge together. And I think that really changed my approach, because since then I have not written a single important report by myself. And that's actually a very, very deliberate approach, because I don't think that the challenges of today can actually be tackled with one brain alone. We need very different kinds of ideas, approaches, knowledge that can then be accumulated and can then be turned into something really good. And I enjoy writing with other people a lot more since then, have this sort of much wider approach. And I have a rule for myself that I think is a really good one. That's learn one new thing every year. So that's how I moved through the technologies, because the playbook has always been the same. The challenges are similar. And it is something that I thought would make a lot of sense for people to demonstrate, that I could see the through line through the China factor from 5G technology to clean tech, to the wind industry, to the solar industry, to the battery industry. And so thereby you just learn more about these fields, and then you can reconnect your old knowledge with your new knowledge, and then actually it becomes real fun.
Right. All right. Thanks for that. That sounds, I really like the sort of distinction that you've made from, research as it was before to now, and the sort of collaborative space that policy is in right now. So if I could ask you a bit about, your current role as a director for the Asia program at ECFR, you're working at sort of, the crossroads of research policy and public debate. What excites you most about the work you're doing right now? And on a more personal level, what is the most impactful research and work that you think that you've been a part of at ECFR?
So actually, there's news to break. I have actually stepped down as director of the Asia program, and I'm now a distinguished policy fellow. But this is very, very recent development, and I think I can describe this really well because it actually answers your questions. The Asia director role is a very specific role where you have a very clear portfolio. And it's very important to do the work in this portfolio on China, on India, the relations with the Indo-Pacific, on EU-China relations, on Japan. But what I've realized is that over time, because I also get bored easily, I need to learn new things all the time, I realized that my interests were getting wider and wider and actually more Europe focused. So what I've realized is that it is actually important that we have people with specific regional expertise that then flip around at some point in their career and look back at Europe and say, okay, what does this mean for us? Because I think this is what's lacking at the moment. So what I'm going to do in the next few years is going to try to build the competitiveness agenda for the Europeans, with my old lens that I have through which I've looked at the world, with my sort of China/Asia lens through which I've looked at the world, but turn that back and say, how do we need to adjust for a world that looks like this right now, particularly in the clean tech space? And how can we drive forward a bold and competitive Europe that keeps the green transition alive? And that's my mission for the next few years that I will drive forward. And I think in terms of sort of really important publications and really important things to be part of, I think one of my pivotal ones was a collaboration with Agatha Kratz from Rhodium Group. It's a report called Home Advantage. Maybe you can link to it in the show notes to this. It's a few years old, but it was sort of setting out a research agenda in terms of the China playbook and what this means for Europe's future industries, and everything following that has built on that. But as ECFR, we are part of a number of discussions behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the curtain and sometimes behind the curtain to shape European outcomes and to shape debates around, for example, the EV tariff conversation that was really important for me in the past, or right now in our little battle about making the European wind industry survive the current challenges. So it's pretty hands-on and pretty practical, but always with a clear focus on Europe's ability to be kind of a player in the world right now.
Right. Got it. If I can move to talking about, I think, your experience in the policy space itself and how you've sort of, been a part of shaping it. Through your work with Women Insight on China, you've sought to, with your team, sought to address concrete challenges like limited access to professional networks, underrepresentation, and a lack of visibility for women in China studies, especially. Which of these barriers, or which barriers do you see as the most urgent to talk about and tackle, and how has which I hope I'm saying that correctly, work to support women to overcome them?
So first of all, I have to make a big shout out here, which is not my initiative, but actually Ivana Karaskova's initiative from Choice. She's in Prague at AMO. Ivana is an absolute force of nature when it comes to women's rights in this space, for women's roles in this place, and has been dragging a gang of women along and saying, look, guys, we need to do something about this. We really need to stand together and actually claim our space, because it is still an area in which male voices are the dominant ones that are influencing the policy discourse, and actually in a growing way this is happening. So what Ivana wants to drive forward is an agenda in which the witches, as they're called, there's obviously a reference here that is sort of a historical reference here, are supposed to be trailblazers for future generations of young women that are in this field, helping them as mentors, helping them in just getting invitations to events, making sure that panel representation is equitable. And that's something that I think that's work that needs to just be done right now. But it's also mentorship for, how do you write a good funding proposal? How do you actually present yourself in a funder conversation with the level of confidence that apparently 25-year-old men are born with? So it's sometimes something that is just being a shoulder that you can lean on a little bit, and could be individual mentoring. It can be kind of little invitations to dinners. It can be just the invitation to a conference, and it can be just general help in for others as well that want to put a diverse conference together and are struggling with finding speakers, etc. So do have Ivana on this podcast. I think she will be kind of the perfect example of what you are looking for, and someone who's an amazing force in European China research.
I think that's really insightful. Just talking about the little things and the little tasks to do that actually, in the bigger picture, go a long way to remove these limits to access and barriers, etc. So I think many think tanks and policy institutions have started initiatives around diversity and inclusion, but there are certain more, structural barriers that still exist. From your perspective, are these efforts that they're currently making enough to create, genuinely inclusive spaces for the next generation of analysts and policymakers?
So maybe in history, we will look back at my generation as sort of the golden generation for women in research and in the policy field, because we have to be super honest. This is a moment of backlash. The patriarchy is striking back on all fronts. The manual is becoming absolutely acceptable again. A lot of people are saying, well, it has actually gone too far. There is and now all of these women are on the panel and they don't actually have even anything to say and contribute. It's just because they're women. I don't know how many times I've heard that. I don't know how many times I've been the token moderator to an all-male panel, where I was probably the person that knew more about the topic than all of them, four of them together. So I think this is something that we just have to realize, that while we have moved quite a bit in this, and while in the China's field in particular, and in the Asia policy circles, there's an amazing group of women in top positions that are leading research efforts and that are leading the debates. To name just a few, I mean, if you take Agatha Kratz, if you take Abigail Vasiliev, if you take Angela Stanzel, you take I will miss out on a few, but Ivana is another. Justina Skudlik, my colleague Alicia Bachulska. I mean, the field is very, very wide. You have Mareike Ulberg, not to forget. There's so many good women on there. So I just want to just make sure that everyone knows that there is a fantastic gang with real influence in this. But for them to continue to be able to operate, and for us to continue to be sort of present in these conversations, it will take a real collective effort. And I think institutions currently feel like they don't really have to. They don't really have to invest in diversity because it's not sort of the talk of the town anymore. It's not actually the feel anymore. So that just means we have to fight harder, and we have to find male advocates as well that are not giving in and that are not giving up on diversity efforts, and that are sort of championing these causes as well, because just by ourselves, it will be really difficult to fight for. And that's why I think it is important to have institutions like Carnegie, like ECFR, that have not participated in the backlash, and that should sort of stand their ground, and move on these debates forward.
Right. Thank you for that. If I could ask you a question about, more of your personal experience. You've worked across, so many different institutions and international settings. What have you learned about adapting to new environments and keeping your sense of purpose consistent through like transitions?
I think it takes a lot of willpower at the moment, and it takes a lot of positivity and reinforcements with colleagues and friends. I'm a mother of two. It also takes other mothers to support each other through this, because obviously the challenges are different. I will never forget one of my first travels when I was a young professional and my daughter was 2 years old. And the only thing I really wanted to do was find a little stuffed animal panda to bring back to her. And I couldn't find one, and I was devastated on the plane. And there was an amazing woman, Sabine Stricker-Kellerer is her name, one of the most fantastic lawyers in the China space. She was on the flight with me, and she was like, "Don't cry about it. We'll find a solution." And on the next day, she had a little bear shipped to my office so I could bring that home to my children. And this bear is actually with us since. My daughter is now 15 years old, and that bear still sits in the corner of her bed. But it was just a symbol of sort of, sometimes you won't get it right, but sometimes someone else steps in and supports you and helps you. And I think that's the sort of important spirit that we have to keep up, that yes, you will not be able to do everything by yourself. You will not always get things right, and you will not always get things right on the first try. But it is sort of there is a collective sense of mission that we have here, that there are values that we want to pursue, and there are ideas that we want to instill in the world, because quite frankly, the world of the 70-plus-year-old man hasn't served us all so super well. And I think what we're seeing right now is that it's not generally moving in the best direction.
Yeah. I do have one last question for you, but before that, I was wondering if you're up for a quick round of rapid fire questions.
All right, go shoot.
So if you weren't working in foreign policy, what do you think you'd be doing instead?
Oh, I'll clearly be writing crime or romance novels in a house by the sea.
Okay, great. What is a book that really shaped how you think, or one that first pulled you into this field?
I think there are two that have sort of had different effects on my brain. One is a book called Working by Robert Caro, who is a journalist who has spent basically all his life writing Lyndon B. Johnson biographies. It is the most thorough, it's a short book, but it's the best work on how to interview people, how to find out things. If you're curious and you ask people, there's lots of things to find out. And this it's just a way of working. That's what it's called, working. That has just had a really good effect on how I think about problems and how I think about finding out more. And the other one that has just had a fantastic effect, and I've quoted it many times, is called Economists at War by Alan Bollard. It's a book about how economists and central bankers, finance ministers during the First and Second World War have sort of shaped the course of the wars. And it just changed my view of history, my understanding, because it was the first one that also connected the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic theater in a way that I had never seen done before in an economics book. So if you want a comprehensive shaking up of your brain a little bit, that one is a perfect book, and I have always applauded Alan Bollard for pulling this off.
Okay, great. Adding those to my reading list. What is a favorite phrase or saying that you've picked up during your travels, maybe in Beijing or somewhere else, that has sort of stayed with you?
So I'm not a big sort of idioms and phrases, because that's the worst thing is, like, in the China studies, like as Confucius said, or as an old Chinese saying goes. But there's a term in Chinese that's 差不多. And it's the antithesis of Germanness. It's the opposite of what Germans are. It means like almost, or yeah, almost there, and like good enough. And Germans are the opposite of good enough. And I think the attitude of 差不多, of this, like, sort of, sometimes it's just good enough. And sometimes that's what gets you forward, because waiting for perfection, which is, I think, a problem that women often have, is actually not going to get you there. But sometimes you just have to trouble it and just have to live with it, that's as good as it gets. And that will bring you to success. And so that word has always stuck in my head.
Great. So I think you already sort of answered this, but I think I'll ask you anyway. What is your go-to non-academic genre? Like, what do you love to watch or read when you want to switch off from work?
So at the moment, I'm totally sold on Slow Horses, a TV series about sort of failed MI5 spies that are still saving the world. That really it makes me very, very happy to watch. Anything with spies actually usually works very well, but also a good rom-com and a good romance and the odd Gilmore Girls can always be there to shut my brain down. I don't think one has to pretend that one watches Hungarian movies with Finnish subtitles in one's free time. I think it's totally okay to binge on a good TV series every once in a while.
Yeah, agreed. So my thank you for that. That was really fun. I'd love to end with one final thought or insight from you. I think, with so many global challenges and shifting power dynamics, what advice would you give to young professionals on finding their voice and making a difference in international relation affairs?
So I think the first main advice is be curious. Like, don't try to lock into a field and say, this is what I am and I will not look left and right. Be curious about what's happening left and right, because it actually will help you move forward. Then the second one would be generate depth. You do need depth on something, right? You can't just be a broad generalist. You need to be an expert for something so that you can then add the pieces left and right. And that's really important as well. Ask questions. Ask people all the time, because actually they have lots of things to say and most people are very sharey. So use the opportunity when you have them to just ask a lot of questions. And then be humble. It is something that is often then missing in this field, where we all have to be humble about what we don't know. And actually, by humbly approaching all of the people in our field and just saying, look, how would you think about this? I think you always get fantastic inroads and conversations started to then actually move debates forward and move onwards. And then you have to show grit. When it hurts and when you don't want to do this anymore, and when you feel like you've hit a wall 4 times already and it has been the same wall, trust me, you can break through it. It's just that it sometimes takes a pretty hard head to do it. But I think that's where women have a particularly good tendency to break through barriers when they seem unsurmountable.
Thank you. That was really good advice. I mean, even just for me to hear. So thank you so much for that. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today, Dr. Janka. And it's been a real pleasure learning from your journey and hearing your thoughts on important issues and the smaller things as well. So yeah, it's been really great talking to you.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity and good luck for your own journey.
Thank you.